In the sweltering summer of 1260, under the blazing Middle Eastern sun, two mighty armies prepared to clash in a battle that would change the course of history forever. The fate of entire civilizations hung in the balance as warriors from east and west gathered near a small spring called Ain Jalut, Goliath's spring, nestled in the ancient Jezreel Valley of what is now northern Israel. What happened there on September 3rd, 1260, would shatter the myth of an unstoppable empire and alter the destiny of the medieval world. For decades, the Mongol Empire had swept across Asia and Europe like a devastating storm. Led by the descendants of the great Genghis Khan, their armies had conquered more land than any empire in history. Their reputation was one of terror. Cities that surrendered were spared. Those that resisted were utterly destroyed. The Mongol warriors were unlike any fighting force the world had seen. Trained from childhood, they could ride for days without rest, shoot arrows with deadly accuracy while galloping at full speed, and execute complex battle maneuvers with perfect discipline. Their tactics were revolutionary, feigned retreats that turned into devastating counterattacks, lightning-fast cavalry movements, and sophisticated siege weapons that could reduce mighty fortresses to rubble. From the frozen steppes of Russia to the Great Wall of China, from the mountains of Korea to the deserts of Persia, the Mongols had defeated every army that dared to stand against them. By 1260, they had conquered more territory in 25 years than the Romans had in 400. In 1258, the Mongol advance reached Baghdad, the crown jewel of Islamic civilization. For 5 centuries, this magnificent city had been the center of science, art, and learning, home to the house of wisdom where scholars preserved and expanded on the knowledge of the ancient world. Led by Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, the Mongol horde surrounded the ancient city. The Caliph of Baghdad, spiritual leader of the Islamic world, refused to surrender, a fatal mistake. When the city walls fell, what followed was one of history's most devastating massacres. For 7 days, Baghdad burned. The waters of the Tigris River ran black with the ink of countless priceless books and red with the blood of scholars, poets, and ordinary citizens. The magnificent libraries and mosques that had preserved Greek, Persian, and Indian knowledge were reduced to ashes. The Caliph himself was wrapped in a carpet and trampled to death by horses, as Mongol tradition forbade spilling royal blood on the ground. The destruction of Baghdad sent shockwaves through the Islamic world. If the greatest Muslim city could fall so completely, what hope did anyone have against the Mongol storm? After Baghdad, Hulagu Khan turned his attention westward. His armies quickly conquered Syria, capturing the major cities of Aleppo and Damascus with relative ease. The mighty Ayyubid dynasty that had once fought against the Crusaders crumbled before the Mongol advance. Next in line was Egypt, ruled by the Mamluks, former slave soldiers who had risen to power. The Mamluks were extraordinary warriors, captured as boys from the Turkic and Circassian peoples, converted to Islam, and trained from childhood in the art of war. Unlike other armies of the time, they were full-time professional soldiers, masters of horseback riding, swordsmanship, and mounted archery. In early 1260, Hulagu sent messengers to Cairo with a chilling ultimatum for Sultan Qutuz. Submit to us and be safe, or defend yourself and perish. After we have conquered you, nothing will remain to you except tears and sighs. If you flee to the damp places or the mountain peaks, we will drag you down like a lion dragging its prey. Sultan Qutuz, once a slave and now ruler of Egypt, faced an impossible choice. History offered little hope. No nation had successfully resisted the Mongol advance. Submission would mean the end of Mamluk power and likely the destruction of Islamic civilization. Resistance seemed equally futile. In a moment of extraordinary boldness that would alter the course of history, Qutuz made his decision. Not only did he refuse to surrender, but he had the Mongol messengers executed and their severed heads displayed on Bab Zuwayla, one of the main gates of Cairo. This unprecedented violation of diplomatic immunity was a clear statement to his people and the Mongols: Egypt would fight to the death. This defiant act seemed to seal Egypt's doom. But then, unexpectedly, fortune intervened. In August 1259, Mongol Khan, the great Khan who ruled the entire Mongol Empire, died during a campaign in China. Mongol tradition required that all princes of the blood return to Mongolia for a Kurultai assembly to select a new great Khan. Hulagu, as a senior Mongol prince, needed to return east with most of his forces. He left behind his trusted general Kitbuka with approximately 10,000 to 20,000 troops to hold their conquered territories until Hulagu could return with a larger army to finish the conquest of Egypt. For the first time, the seemingly invincible Mongol war machine had been weakened. Sultan Qutuz recognized this might be the only chance to strike. Qutuz quickly allied himself with Baibars, another Mamluk commander who had fled to Egypt after the Mongols captured Damascus. Baibars was a military genius who had intimate knowledge of the terrain in Palestine and Syria. Together, they devised a daring plan. In a surprising diplomatic move, the Mamluks negotiated with their traditional enemies, the remaining Crusader states along the coast, especially the Kingdom of Jerusalem centered in Acre. Though Muslims and Christians had been bitter enemies for centuries, both recognized the Mongols as the greater threat. The Crusaders made an extraordinary decision. They allowed the Mamluk army to march through their territory unmolested and even camp near Acre to resupply. As one Crusader chronicler noted, "The lesser enemy has become our friend against the greater enemy." By late August 1260, Qutuz had assembled a formidable army and marched north from Egypt into Palestine. His force likely numbered between 20,000 and 30,000 warriors, primarily Mamluk cavalry, disciplined, professional soldiers who had trained together for years. Meanwhile, Kitbuka gathered his forces and moved south from their base at Baalbek in modern Lebanon. His army included Mongol warriors, local Syrian auxiliaries, Georgian infantry, and Armenian troops from Cilicia. Though smaller than the Mamluk force, the Mongols had never lost a major field battle, and their confidence remained absolute. The two armies converged near the spring of Ain Jalut. The location was no accident. Baibars, who knew the terrain intimately, had chosen it specifically because the rolling hills and limited sight lines would neutralize the Mongols' traditional advantages of mobility and long-range archery. On September 3rd, 1260, as dawn broke over the Jezreel Valley, the air was thick with tension. The Mamluk and Mongol armies faced each other across the valley floor, two entirely different military traditions, each with their own strengths, about to clash in a fight that would determine the fate of civilizations. Baibars, knowing the Mongols' tactics well, had devised a strategy to turn their strengths against them. He would lead the vanguard of the Mamluk army personally and employ the Mongols' own tactic of feigned retreat against them. As the morning sun climbed higher, Baibars advanced with a portion of the Mamluk army. His forces moved forward with precise discipline, their armor gleaming in the sunlight, weapons at the ready. The initial clashes were fierce, with arrows darkening the sky as both sides engaged at a distance. The Mongol archers, masters of the powerful composite bow, released volley after volley of deadly arrows. The Mamluks, well-armored and disciplined, held their formation despite casualties. Then, following their carefully laid plan, Baibars gave the signal for retreat. The Mamluk vanguard suddenly appeared to break formation and flee in disarray. Warriors turned their horses and galloped away from the Mongols, seemingly in panic. Dust clouds billowed behind them as they retreated toward the northern highland passes. Kitbuka, seeing what appeared to be a routing enemy, could not resist the opportunity for a decisive victory. With a roar of triumph, he ordered a full pursuit. The Mongol forces surged forward eagerly, their disciplined formation giving way to the excitement of the chase. They had seen this scenario play out dozens of times before, a fleeing enemy soon to be cut down from behind. "After them! Let none escape!" Kitbuka reportedly shouted as he led his forces forward. The Mongols raced after the retreating Mamluks, following them into the narrow valleys that led into the highlands. The dusty valley floor gave way to rougher terrain as they advanced, the wide open spaces narrowing between the hills. The fleeing Mamluks led their pursuers deeper and deeper into the trap, drawing them into the highland terrain where Baibars knew the Mongols would lose their greatest advantages: mobility and coordinated mass archery. As the Mongols pursued the retreating Mamluks into the highlands, something unexpected happened. The fleeing warriors suddenly stopped their retreat and turned to face their pursuers. At that same moment, war cries erupted from the hills on both sides. The main body of the Mamluk army, hidden among the hills and trees, emerged from all sides. The trap had been sprung. Thousands of Mamluk warriors who had been concealed in the highlands now revealed themselves, closing in on the Mongol forces from every direction. Arrows rained down on the surprised Mongol forces, followed by the thunderous charge of heavily armored Mamluk cavalry. The narrow valleys prevented the Mongols from using their superior mobility to escape and regroup. The hunters had become the hunted. But the Mongols were not easily defeated. They were veterans of countless battles, and their discipline held even in this desperate situation. Kitbuka quickly rallied his forces, forming a defensive circle. The Mongols fought back ferociously, unleashing arrows at close range and then drawing their swords for hand-to-hand combat when the Mamluks closed in. The battle raged with incredible intensity. The clash of metal on metal, the screams of wounded men and horses, and the thunder of hooves filled the air. The ground became slick with blood as warriors on both sides fell. Yet the Mongols, though surrounded, refused to surrender. For hours, the battle raged under the scorching Palestinian sun. Despite being surrounded, the Mongol warriors fought with remarkable discipline and courage. Then, in a stunning display of battlefield leadership, Kitbuka organized a powerful counterattack aimed at the Mamluk left flank. The Mongol warriors, sensing a chance to break free from the encirclement, fought with renewed vigor. Their concentrated assault began to push back the Mamluk forces on the left. Slowly, but surely, a gap began to open in the Mamluk lines. If the Mongols could break through this weakness, they might escape the trap and regroup on open ground where their superior mobility could once again give them the advantage. The Mamluk left wing began to buckle under the weight of the Mongol assault. Warriors fell back, and panic threatened to spread through their ranks. The entire battle hung in the balance. If the Mongols broke through, the trap would fail, and the Mamluks might still face defeat. Sultan Qutuz, watching from a nearby hill with his reserve forces, recognized the critical moment had arrived. In a gesture of extraordinary personal courage that would be remembered for centuries, he removed his helmet so his men could recognize his face. "Where are you going, O Muslims?" he shouted to his retreating troops. Then, raising his sword high, he called out 3 times, "O Islam! O Allah, grant your servant Qutuz a victory against these Mongols." With these words echoing across the battlefield, Qutuz himself charged directly into the thickest part of the fighting, where the Mongols were breaking through, followed by his personal guard of elite Mamluk warriors. The sight of their sultan risking his life alongside them galvanized the Mamluk forces. "Wa Islama, O my Islam," became the battle cry as Mamluk warriors surged forward with renewed determination. The momentum of the battle shifted dramatically. The Mongol breakthrough was halted as Qutuz and his fresh troops slammed into their flank. Though the tide had turned against them, the Mongol warriors refused to flee. Kitbuka, surrounded but unbowed, continued to direct his forces with remarkable skill. When several of his officers urged him to break out of the encirclement and save himself, he reportedly replied with defiance, "It is better to die by the sword than to flee. My bones shall remain in Syria, but yours shall be carried by the wind. The world shall remember that we died fighting, not running like cowards." The Mongol resistance gradually weakened as their numbers dwindled. Warriors fell one by one, overwhelmed by the superior Mamluk numbers. The encirclement tightened like a noose around the remaining Mongol forces. Finally, after hours of desperate fighting, Kitbuka himself was captured. The Mongol general, bloodied but still proud, was brought before Sultan Qutuz. According to chroniclers, he warned the victorious Mamluk ruler, "My death will be avenged. Countless Mongol warriors will ensure that your victory today becomes meaningless tomorrow." But there would be no tomorrow for Kitbuka. The Mongol general was executed, and his remaining forces were hunted down and destroyed. For the first time in their westward expansion, the Mongols had suffered a major defeat. The impact of the Battle of Ain Jalut rippled outward immediately. Within days, the Mamluks had recaptured Damascus. Within weeks, most of Syria had been freed from Mongol control. The myth of Mongol invincibility had been shattered forever. When news of the defeat reached Hulagu Khan, he ordered the execution of his remaining prisoners and prepared for a massive counterattack to avenge the loss. However, civil war within the Mongol Empire prevented him from marshalling his full strength. His cousin Burqa Khan, ruler of the Golden Horde and a convert to Islam, had been horrified by Hulagu's destruction of Baghdad and now moved against him in the Caucasus. Mongol fought Mongol for the first time, further weakening their ability to respond to the Mamluk victory. Sultan Qutuz did not live long to enjoy his historic triumph. On the return journey to Cairo, he was assassinated by a group of emirs led by Baibars, who then took power as the new sultan. Despite this betrayal, both men are remembered as heroes who saved Islamic civilization from possibly being extinguished. On that hot September day in 1260, near a spring named after the biblical giant Goliath, another giant, the seemingly unstoppable Mongol Empire, met its David. The world would never be the same again. The Mongol Empire, under the leadership of Genghis Khan, known to us as Genghis Khan, transitioned from a series of often squabbling tribes nestled in the Mongolian steppes to by 1206 a unified entity. Genghis Khan would die in 1227, but his lands would be enlarged and further consolidated by his descendants, one of those, his grandson, Husha Khan, or Kublai Khan, who would expand the empire to its greatest extent. The Mongol Empire would grow with spectacular military successes, crushing kingdoms in all directions under hoof and arrow. The savagery and mobility with which the Mongol forces carried out their expansion was without equal to that point in time. The Mongols' mobility born out of the steppes, a byproduct of their nomadic lifestyle. While the horses they rode were not the fastest, each Mongol rider would often have several and rotate between them, so they all got a break from being mounted. They could cover up to 160 kilometers or 100 miles per day, and as a result, could descend fast and unpredictably, like a storm distant on the horizon one moment, then a sweeping maelstrom directly overhead the next. Along with their successes, there would also be some spectacular failures. One of those would be the small isolated island nation of Japan. They would send the winds of war Japan's way, and Japan would counter with a storm of defiance. The Japanese had managed to avoid direct contact and conflict with the Mongol Empire, as they had no official diplomatic relations with either of their direct neighbors, China or Korea. Other than trade and raiding, they kept to themselves and their own affairs. The Mongols, though, had heard of Japan as being a land of much gold and riches. Marco Polo had written this about Japan. The people on the island of Zipangu have measureless quantities of gold. The king's palace is roofed with pure gold, and the floors are paved in gold, 2 fingers thick. This account was likely known to the Khan, as Japan, as a source of gold production, had been well known to the rulers of China. There are written accounts that previous delegations from China in earlier centuries had returned home with kilogram upon kilograms of gold. These and other accounts all contributed to the legend of Japan as a land of gold, but in fact, Japan was more a land of silver, the Khan may have also had other more personal reasons for the invasion. In 1266, Kublai Khan sent 2 envoys to Japan with a letter stating that the 2 countries should establish friendly relations. However, there were statements made in the letter that, while perhaps common for the Mongols, the Japanese perceived as insulting, the mention of their emperor as a mere king for one, and the veiled hints at becoming a tributary vassal state. The most egregious, though, perhaps, was the last paragraph, which seemed to imply the threat of war for non-compliance. The end result of this first official contact would be envoys returning back empty-handed, as would a second set of envoys in 1268, and additional ones sent in 1269, 1271, and 1272. But those Japan would not even allow to land on their shores. Japan had since the late 1100s been ruled by a military dictatorship located in Kamakura, under the control of the Hojo. The emperor, whose court resided in Kyoto, was functionally more of a figurehead. The Emperor Kameyama's chamberlain had written an edict stating that a Ninoi curse would be levied against the Mongols. This, coupled with the later tsunami storm, would lay the foundation for future divinity legends surrounding the protection of Japan. The Japanese culture would continue to meld divinity and nature as they had since their animist past, even under Buddhism and Shintoism. The samurai was also likened to cherry blossoms, as his life, while glorious, was prone to sudden end during military service, similar to petals shed by cherry blossoms. As indicated previously, the real power in Japan lay with the Kamakura shogunate. Technically under the shogun, but in reality its de facto head was Hojo Tukimune, who had inherited the title as the 6th reigning Hojo Shiken, or regent, from his father in 1256 due to his father's failing health. Neither the Khan nor the Hojo would directly take part in the fighting that was to come. 2 armies that differed considerably in appearance, tactics, and armaments. While both prided themselves as horseback archers, their approach to it was very different. The samurai firing the arrows on horseback were heavily armored in the 13th century, and they rode smaller horses than the Mongols did. While the Mongols also had heavy cavalry, their archers tended to be organized in a looser configuration than their Japanese counterparts, and they were more light cavalry armor-wise. The Mongols would deliver their also shorter arrows in huge volleys from their ranks, whereas the Japanese method was to send but a single arrow against a chosen and hopefully worthy opponent to earn him honor and glory on the battlefield. The tactical formation of the Japanese was more war-banded in approach, with each led by a prominent samurai and his followers. As mentioned, the Japanese would traditionally send the single arrow with a special signaling tip that would whistle as it flew to initiate the combat. The Mongols, meanwhile, fought with more rank-and-file structure, often using drums to signal battlefield maneuvers. They had also access to Chinese inventions such as exploding grenade-like bombs made of both paper and iron and delivered by catapults. These were among the first examples of gunpowder explosions heard in Japan. The samurai arms and armor consisted of the following: an armor called yoroi. It was made from small scales tied together and lacquered, then combined into armor plates by binding them together with silk, cords, or ones made of leather. This created a flexible defensive armor capable of absorbing the high-impact energy of enemy blows. Both iron and leather were used, as a fully iron suit was deemed too heavy. Thus, the iron was used for the most protective portions of the armor. The body of the yoroi armor consisted of 4 main sections, 2 large shoulder plates fastened at the back by a large ornamental bow, with 2 guards to protect the tying cords from being cut. Then, there were the arm sections that provided free movement while keeping the body covered. Next was the helmet made from iron plates fastened together with large projecting conical rivets, with the neck protected via a heavy 5-piece neck guard. Some samurai would also wear face masks. Generally, the shooting arm was kept armor-free to more easily allow arrows to be fired quickly and efficiently. Each samurai would also have a sword forged by a celebrated master, and it was one of the most prized gifts that a samurai could receive from a leader. These swords were almost reaching their zenith of perfection by the time of the Mongol invasions. Their long, curved blades were razor-sharp and could cut deeply into the brigandine-like coats of enemies like the Mongols. Lastly, the Japanese bow. They were longer bows made out of deciduous wood and backed with bamboo for added reinforcement. They were lacquered to weatherproof them and used bamboo arrows. On horseback, the bow was held high to the head to clear the horse, with the drawing hand pulled back to the ear. In contrast, the Mongol army, while often said to have been lightly armored, was in fact very diverse. While the common soldiers and horseback archers were more lightly armored, the Mongols also had contingents of heavy cavalry units who appeared depicted in the Japanese-Mongol invasion scrolls. The lighter armor worn by those lighter units formed the foundation for all units, including the heavier armored ones. It was a heavy coat fastened by a leather belt at the waist, which also carried the sword, dagger, and sometimes even an axe. Boots were stout but comfortable and made from felt and leather. The head, covered in a hat made of felt and fur. The heavier armored units had over top of this a coat made in the Asiatic style of lummular armor, which consisted of small scales of iron or leather, or combined and then pierced with holes and sewn together via leather thongs. They wore helmets made from a number of large iron pieces shaped roughly into a conical shape and featured iron-plated neck guards, much like the samurai armor. The heavy cavalry horses would likewise be protected by lummular armor. Mongol bows were shorter than the Japanese ones. They were composite reflex bows in design made from yak horn, sinew, and bamboo glued together into a single set piece. The bow was strung against the natural curve, giving it an exceptionally strong pull. Each archer typically carried multiple bows and a quiver with both regular and poison-tipped arrows. They also carried rounded wooden shields for personal protection, and their swords were slightly curved and saber-like in design. By 1271, the Mongols had dealt successive blows to the Chinese Song dynasty south of the growing Mongol Empire. The impact of this was the symbolic transition of the Mongol Empire from nomadic dwellers in tents to the more sedentary rulers of a civilized state. The Mongols had crept even closer to Japan by initiating an invasion of Korea in the year 1231. Despite valiant efforts by both its military and civilians, the Mongol attacks were relentless. There were moments of peace, but over the decades, the Mongols would send in wave after wave, and eventually, by 1259, the Koreans battle-weary capitulated. By the year 1273, the Mongols had unified their Korean invasion by marrying themselves into the Korean royal family. They would now have two separate coastal areas with which to launch an invasion against Japan. Numbers for the invasion fleet and the Japanese defenders for the first invasion attempt vary wildly. The likely numbers for the Mongol expedition force, likely 30,000 strong, with hundreds of ships. The Japanese force, based on the number of samurai band and average number of each, indicated that their force is likely numbered between 4,000 and 8,000. This would indicate a ratio of Mongol to Japanese of roughly 6-1. The invasion fleet set sail on the 2nd of November 1274 from the southern end of the Korean peninsula. They first reached the island of Tsushima, which is featured in the video game Ghost of Tsushima. The island consisted of two main islands separated by a narrow strait. The Mongols would use a two-pronged assault, hitting both islands via 4 places on its western coast. Each island they attacked at 2 spots, with the main bulk of their force hitting the southern island at Sasura. Their vessels spotted by islanders on the evening of the 4th of November. This provided the island's deputy Jaido, a man by the name of Susuke Kuni, with some time to hastily scramble together a defense. The Japanese were superstitious in the sense they believed in kami, or spirits, and omens. On the day the Mongols approached, a shrine dedicated to Hachiman the god of war caught on fire. While the fire was quickly extinguished, supposedly as messengers were to deliver news of this as a bad omen, just then, a flock of white doves landed upon the shrine's roof. and it was then instead interpreted as a warning, not as a disaster. Skikuni's command consisted of 80 mounted samurai warriors and their followers. He led them over a mountain pass at night to take up positions near the Mongol main assault landing force at Sasura. It must have been a tense wait for dawn. For dawn, however, would not arrive before the Mongols. At roughly 2 a.m. they landed, and intense, ferocious fighting would break out at 4 a.m. Skikuni had taken an interpreter along to see if discourse with the Mongols was possible. But it was not, as the Mongol reply would be a volley of arrows fired overhead as 1,000 of their warriors from the beachhead charged the Japanese. Skikuni had his samurai return a volley of arrows back, and their precision archery managed to kill many of the Mongols, but yet they charged. As the fighting raged on the beaches, 2 Japanese boats managed to slip through the Mongol fleet to take a message to the rest of the Japanese islands that the war had started. Saito Skasada, one of Skikuni's closest men, had enthusiastically attacked and killed a high-ranking senior Mongol officer who, along with his group, had gotten stuck in a grove of beachside trees. The Mongols returned fire at him, first with a stone-hurling catapult, then a volley of arrows, 3 of which pierced deeply into his chest. Half of Skikuni's followers would die from the overwhelming Mongol numbers, but even as their number dropped below half, and then a quarter, they fought on bravely until all, including Skikuni, were dead. The Mongols would set fire to every building in the vicinity and slaughter most of the inhabitants. They would spend another 9 days securing the island before leaving to head for the smaller island of Iki to the south. On the 13th of November, the deputy Jido Thera, a man by the name of Taira Kagetaka, was said to have hailed from the family by the same name that was defeated during the Genpei War. Kagetaka had received word of the coming Mongols while he was at his castle headquarters. He immediately sent urgent word to Zaif on the main South Island of Japan for reinforcements. Kagetaka and his followers fought similarly on the beaches when the Mongols landed. They had arrived later in the day, so despite losing half his men, the Mongols would retreat back to their ships at nightfall, giving Kagetaka and his men some reprieve. So he ordered what was left of them back to his castle. In the castle, they hoped to hold out and protect the women and children until mainland reinforcements could come. By morning, though, they were surrounded by the full landing force and their red-bannered war tugs. The Japanese women would take up arms in an attempt to bolster the defense. But the Mongols shattered the castle's front gate, and with no relief forces having arrived to assist, Kagetaka prepared to lead his men out with a final arrow, assault, and charge. However, when they arrived in the open courtyard, hundreds of their fellow countrymen from the surrounding villages had been tied up into a human shield. In response, some of the Japanese dropped their bows, unsheathed their swords, and charged at the Mongols. Although they were said to have fought valiantly, the Mongols overwhelmed them, and Kagetaka and his family and most of his senior men would commit ritual suicide. All would be slaughtered, save one, Kagetaka's daughter, whom he had sent to decipher with one of his trusted samurai the day before. The Mongols would next turn their attention towards the main Japanese islands. The Japanese, at the regional seat of government in Dazaif, had already been alerted by messengers of the events in Tsushima and Iki, and surmised correctly that to get there, the Mongols' most likely safe landing spot would be Hakata Bay. Enthusiastic defense preparations were made. Japanese records indicated that in the surrounding 9 provinces, horsemen gathered, each trying to outdo the other. Shonikinesuke, the younger brother of the Shugo, would take up defensive positions near the Hachiman Shrine. The Mongol plan was to move eastwards along the coast to Hakata and then turn inland up the river to Dazaif. Accounts state that the pace of the fighting was initiated by the Mongols. They disembarked from their ships, mounted their horses, raised their red war banners, and began their attack as they had the previous 2 occasions. It was said that the Japanese grandson of one of the commanders loosed a single arrow to initiate combat per tradition. This was said to have been met with raucous laughter from the Mongols. They used tactics that were so unfamiliar to the Japanese, such as advancing on foot in large, dense groups protected by shields. The Japanese, meanwhile, had to this point generally fought more as individuals in those war bands, seeking out worthy opponents to accrue glorious accounts of individual prowess. The Mongols quickly secured the heights of the landing areas where the generals gave commands to beat those war drums. These commands indicated whether troops should retreat in times of trouble or advance. The Mongols would also surround prearranged Japanese positions and use their explosive iron and paper balls strategically whenever they advanced or had to retreat. The Mongols pushed through the Japanese at the beach and towards Dazaif, the Japanese preparing to make their last stand at Mizuki Castle, which was the lone buffer left between them and Dazaif. The Mongols would arrive by dusk of that same landing day, having quickly moved inland. The defenders were under the command of Shoni Kanesuke. He managed to shoot a senior Mongol commander who was said to have been over 6.5 feet tall, or 2.1 meters, shooting him in the face and capturing his horse. There's speculation that the loss of all these commanders was the reason the Mongols did not push on to Dazaif. The Mongols would instead retreat back to the beaches and the ships, but burning all in their path back, sparing no one. They were estimated to have lost a third of their forces, though. While this would be from the Japanese point of view most certainly a victory, we don't know exactly what the Mongol initial plan was. Perhaps it was a hit-and-run raid meant to sow fear and force a capitulation. We've no records of Kublai Khan's reaction to the invasion or how much he knew. What we do know is that the next year, he again sent 2 envoys to Japan. The envoys, based on records, did not take the most direct route. Perhaps they had some glimpse of what fate awaited them, for they would take 2 months to arrive, and no sooner would they arrive with their great Khan's message than they would be beheaded. Nothing similar had been recorded occurring to the previous Mongol envoys to Japan. The Khans hoped likely that the Japanese were ready to capitulate before a second invasion attempt, but the message that they sent back via the beheadings was one that capitulation would not happen easily. When Kublai Khan finally received word about the disastrous first invasion, he would attempt to send troops to Korea to prepare for a second, but he would rescind the order, as this was when his armies were in their final push to the Song's southern capital, shown earlier. The Great Khan therefore must have realized focusing his eastern military efforts on the Song's capital was the more prudent plan. This would provide the Japanese with 7 years of intervening peace, but they would regardless make preparations for what they likely knew was a delayed but incoming storm. They would make preparations both of a physical, defensive nature, but also based on their perceptions of events, religious ones as well. The physical preparations included the construction of a long defensive wall along the shore of Hakata Bay, the length close to 20 kilometers in its entirety east to west. It was built in most places roughly 50 meters from the shore and meant to hold the Mongols at bay to provide enough time for countermeasures. Those who displayed cowardice during the first invasion were dealt with, and he was displaying valor and courage were rewarded. A new round of recruitment for samurai was also initiated in 1276, one that was irrespective of their vassal status. They had also planned to preemptively raid Korea, but did not end up committing the resources. They did not bolster the defenses on Iki or Tsushima, however, indicating their acceptance of both likely being overrun and their confidence being placed instead on the potential beachhead again at Hakata Bay. In 1277, they learned of the defeat of the Southern Song and must have known the Mongols would once again cast an eye towards their shores. In 1279, the Khan would send yet another last-ditch envoy attempt, but like their predecessors, they too were executed upon landing on Japanese shores. The following year, in 1280, he would summon a top-level conference at one of his summer palaces to discuss the strategy for the second invasion. Having learned lessons from the first, it was clear this one would be of a much larger scale. The wreckage of Mongol ships that were found contained farming implements on them, indicating the Mongols were prepared for a permanent, long-term occupation of Japan. Also different was this attack would be two-pronged, one fleet from Korea as before, and a second, this time, from southern China. It's clear that these were still not always the best soldiers, as those were likely engaged elsewhere in the empire, as records show that prisoners were given commuted sentences to serve in the second invasion. And despite the contribution from southern China, Korea would again bear a disproportionate portion of the burden. While 600 warships were commissioned from the Chinese, the Koreans had to prepare 900. Again, troop estimates were prone to exaggeration and either under or overestimated, depending on which side tells the account. Based estimates are an army roughly 3 times the size of the Mongol force from 1274, and the Japanese also likely much larger than the defensive force from the previous attempt. The order from the Khan to attack Japan was given on the first lunar month in the year 1281. The eastern assault from Korea would be carried out similarly to the first invasion. A Chinese fleet consisting of the south of the Yangtze force would sail across 768 kilometers of ocean to meet up with the eastern forces and then combine near the island of Iki for a single massive attack. The Mongol military general Arakan was given supreme command of the invading forces, and he would travel with the southern fleet. The eastern route Mongol army from Korea set sail on the 22nd of May, 1281, but took longer than the first fleet in 1274 to arrive at Tsushima, arriving on the 9th of June. Without recorded reinforcement and resigned to the same fate of his late father, so Moriaki, son of Skasara, would meet the overwhelming Mongol landing party and die. 300 islanders would be killed, and of these, some had taken children and women to hide in the mountains, but Mongol patrols found these too and slaughtered them. What forces the Japanese did have on the islands were on Iki, which the Mongols breached on the 14th of June. A Japanese army under the command of Shonisuke Toki and Yusosuke Toki said to have been in the low thousands to meet the Mongols on the western Iki beaches, where they were routed and killed. The Mongols were to have waited for the southern army to arrive, but for some unrecorded reason, they did not, attacking both islands immediately instead. It's likely that spies from China provided intelligence on the wall defense at Hakata. Even after Iki, the Mongol Eastern Fleet did not wait for the south to join them, instead splitting their eastern fleet in two, one to attack Hakata, and the other to head east and attack Nagato, at the tip of Honshu. This occurred on the 25th of June, but details are scarce. We do know that there's no recorded damage, only rumors that the fleet had been seen. The Eastern Fleet, half that was to land at Hakata Bay, did not have the anticipated element of surprise. The Japanese had not only manned sections of the wall with archers, but breaking with tradition, had received direct orders to fully cooperate as a whole. Mongol crafts that made attempts to land on the shores were met with volleys of arrows from archers hidden behind the walls where they could not return fire. While the Mongols did not likely incur heavy casualties, they did make a decision to delay landing for now and instead take possession of the two bay islands of Shiga and Noko. Although Shiga Island was really more of a peninsula in that it was connected by a thin strip of sandbar to the mainland. The Japanese, though, rather than sit back, would take the fight to the Mongol ships that laid anchor. They attacked via the sandbar on foot, but their most successful tactic was one of utilizing a large number of smaller vessels to attack the much larger ocean-going Mongol fleet, the mass of the small ships providing makeshift bridges by which to climb on board the Mongol vessels. Some samurai were said to have swam over to the Mongol ships to attack. We know that those successful boarding attempts resulted in the taking of Mongol heads for future reward. Ultimately, it would be the success, though, of the little ship raids that would pay the largest dividend for the Japanese against their invader foe. Finally, on the 7th lunar month in July, the southern fleet arrived. Plans between them would be fleshed out over the course of July and would result in a new target, the island of Takashima, roughly 50 kilometers further west of Hakata Bay. On the 12th of August, as the Mongol fleet neared Takashima, the Japanese little ship fleets were there to meet them. Fighting initiated almost immediately, and it raged on through the night for many bloody hours. While details of the storms said to have assisted the Japanese during the first invasion are suspect, there is definitive archaeological evidence for a great storm assisting them during the second. As the ship battles raged on for days, with the Mongols not able to make any landing attempts and the Japanese likely being mostly fended off in the more open water, neither side could make much headway. At some point later in the month of August, which is midway during typhoon season, a storm came rolling in. As it neared, it intensified in its ferocity. It was recorded that ships near the shore collided with each other, snapping free or flailing about at the end of their anchor ropes. Men were washed overboard and drowned or dashed against the rocky shores nearby. Those in the deeper waters cut anchor to try to ride out the storm. The sound of splitting timber must have rivaled that of the storm collapse itself. We don't have exact numbers for the loss of life, but a Korean source says that of the 27,000 Koreans sent on the eastern route, 7,500 did not return, indicating a casualty rate of roughly 30%. It's interesting in that the Chinese and Mongol sources indicate a casualty rate of 60 to 90. Was this perhaps to save face? Again, speculation, as we don't have definitive evidence. Those boats that had cut free would make their way back to China and Korea, abandoning any survivors who managed to wash up on the shores to their fate. And their fate being slaughter at the hands of the Japanese, who carefully rounded the shorelines and the waters in vessels, killing any and all survivors. Some sources say, though, that the Song Chinese, whom the Japanese felt were coerced into joining the attack on Japan, were spared, but even their fate would be that of slaves. Speculation on the discrepancy between the Korean and Mongol Chinese estimates rages on to this day, with some feeling that the Eastern Fleet was more battle-hardened. But again, we don't have definitive evidence. A third attempt was tossed around, but soon the Khan would be embroiled in a series of frontier battles, and the invasion of Japan would fade into history. But not in Japan. There, it would become a source of national pride, and a sort of divinity cult would arise around the kamikaze, which they would call the Great Typhoon that struck the Mongol fleet. And here ends the Mongol invasions of Japan. In the steamy jungles and winding rivers of medieval Vietnam, one of history's most remarkable military upsets unfolded. 3 times during the 13th century, the mighty Mongol Empire, conquerors of China, Russia, Persia, and much of the known world, sent their armies to crush the small Vietnamese kingdom of Dai Viet. 3 times, they were defeated by a people who refused to surrender their homeland. This is the story of how the fierce dragon of the South stood firm against the seemingly unstoppable wave of the Great Khan's armies. By the late 1200s, the Mongol Empire stretched across most of Asia and into Europe. Led by the descendants of Genghis Khan, Mongol armies had toppled ancient kingdoms, destroyed mighty cities, and killed millions. Their horsemen moved like lightning across the land. Their tactics were revolutionary, and their reputation struck terror into even the bravest hearts. After conquering China in 1279, the great Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, established the Yuan dynasty and set his sights on the lands to the south. The small kingdom of Dai Viet, Great Viet, located in what is now northern Vietnam, was next on his list. This fertile land, with its rich resources and access to the sea, would make a valuable addition to the Mongol Empire. But the Vietnamese were not an easy target. For centuries, they had fought against Chinese invaders and developed a fierce sense of independence. They had built their identity through resistance, with mountains, jungles, and rivers serving as their natural fortresses. The first Mongol invasion came in 1258, even before the complete conquest of China. a Mongol army of approximately 30,000 warriors led by General Uryankadai, son of the legendary Mongol General Subutai, marched south from China's Yunnan province into Vietnamese territory. The Mongols swept through the northern territories like wildfire. Their advance seemed unstoppable as village after village fell. Vietnamese defenders tried to make stands at river crossings and mountain passes, but the superior Mongol cavalry and archery overwhelmed them. Blood soaked into the rich soil of the Red River Valley as local militias were cut down by expert Mongol horsemen. The fighting grew fiercer as the Mongols approached Thong Long. The Vietnamese Emperor Tran Tai Tong ordered his forces to defend the city, but the walls could not withstand the Mongol siege weapons. After a 3-day battle that left thousands of dead, the Mongols captured Thong Long, forcing the Vietnamese emperor to flee. The Mongol victory celebration was short-lived. Within weeks, problems began to surface. The hot, humid climate sapped the strength of the Mongol warriors and their horses, who were accustomed to the cool, dry steppes of Central Asia. Diseases spread rapidly through their ranks, tropical fevers, dysentery, and infections that left fighting men bedridden or dead. More dangerous still was the Vietnamese response. Rather than accepting defeat, local leaders organized resistance everywhere. At night, small bands of Vietnamese fighters would slip into Mongol camps, slit the throats of sentries, and disappear before the alarm could be raised. Supply trains were ambushed on narrow jungle paths, with arrows raining down from the dense canopy above. The Vietnamese poisoned wells and food stores left behind, causing more Mongol casualties. One Mongol officer reportedly wrote, "We defeat their armies, but their people continue fighting. We capture their cities, but control nothing beyond our camps. This is a land where victory feels like defeat." Facing mounting casualties and an enemy that refused to stay beaten, General Uryankadai eventually withdrew his forces. This withdrawal wasn't seen as a defeat back in the Mongol capital, merely a strategic pause before a more determined effort. For the next 27 years, the Vietnamese prepared for the return of the Mongols, which they knew was inevitable. Emperor Tran Tan Tong and his successor strengthened defenses, trained more soldiers, and most importantly, united their people around a central idea: that their homeland was worth any sacrifice to protect. A brilliant military commander emerged during this time, Tran Hung Jiao, a member of the royal family, who would become Vietnam's greatest military hero. He understood that the Vietnamese could never match the Mongols in open battle. Instead, they would need to use the land itself as a weapon and fight on their own terms. Tran Hung Jiao wrote a famous proclamation to the Vietnamese troops: "The Mongols are strong, but our cause is just. They may have conquered many lands, but they do not know our mountains, our rivers, our people. We fight for our homes, our ancestors, and our children. This is our land, and we will defend every inch of it with our blood." His words sparked a flame of resistance that would endure through the coming trials. In 1285, Kublai Khan launched a massive invasion of Jai Vihet. Frustrated by the small kingdom's continued defiance and their refusal to submit to Mongol authority, he sent an army of approximately 500,000 troops, one of the largest forces the Mongols had ever assembled. This army was led by his son, Prince Togon, and included elite Mongol cavalry, Chinese infantry, and war machines designed to crush cities. The invasion came from two directions. A land force pushed down from the north, while a naval force sailed up from the south. The plan was to catch the Vietnamese in a giant pincer movement, crushing them between the two advancing armies. The early battles were devastating for the Vietnamese. At Binh Thanh, a force of 70,000 Vietnamese troops tried to block the Mongol advance. The battle began at dawn, with Mongol drums and horns creating a terrifying din. Wave after wave of armored Mongol cavalry charged the Vietnamese lines. By midday, the battlefield was littered with thousands of Vietnamese bodies, and the survivors were in full retreat. Similar scenes played out across the north. The Mongol war machine seemed unstoppable as it rolled toward Thunglong. When they reached the capital, the Mongols unleashed their full fury. Massive catapults hurled boulders that smashed through the city's defenses. Flaming projectiles arced over the walls, setting buildings ablaze. After a bloody 5-day battle, the city fell once again. Prince Togan set up his headquarters in the captured palace and sent messengers to the retreating Vietnamese court, demanding immediate surrender. Victory appeared certain for the invaders, but Tran Hung Jiao had anticipated this and prepared a brilliant response. Rather than futilely defending fixed positions against superior numbers, he ordered a tactical retreat into the countryside. As they withdrew, the Vietnamese implemented a scorched earth policy, burning rice fields, destroying crops, poisoning wells, and removing anything that might be useful to the invaders. "Let the jungle feed us and starve them," Tran Hung Jiao told his officers. "Every day they spend in our land makes them weaker, while we grow stronger." The Mongols found themselves in an increasingly desperate situation. The searing tropical heat reached over 100 degrees, with humidity that made armor unbearable to wear. Unfamiliar diseases spread through their camps like wildfire. Their horses, crucial to Mongol warfare, grew thin and weak in the humid climate and difficult terrain. Supply lines stretched thin, and food became scarce due to the scorched earth tactics. Most dangerously, the Mongols were being pulled deeper into territory where their traditional advantages meant little. The dense jungles neutralized their superior mobility and archery. The network of rivers and swamps created natural barriers to their advance. After luring the Mongols deep into Vietnamese territory, Tran Hung Jiao launched his counterattack. The surprise was complete. Hundreds of Mongol soldiers died in the first minutes of the attack. The survivors fled, abandoning vital supplies that the Vietnamese quickly gathered. This was just the beginning. Vietnamese forces, who had been hiding in the forests and mountains, emerged to strike at isolated Mongol units throughout the region. They attacked at night, using their knowledge of the terrain to appear and disappear like ghosts. At the Battle of Ham Tu, Vietnamese naval forces clashed with Mongol ships on the Red River. The smaller Vietnamese vessels darted between the larger enemy ships, their crews hurling fire pots that set the Mongol craft ablaze. The smoke from burning ships darkened the sky as hundreds of Mongol sailors jumped into the river, where many drowned in their heavy armor. A Mongol chronicle later described the fighting. "The Viet warriors came like the wind and vanished like the mist. They struck from all directions, even from beneath the water and from the tops of trees. They knew every path, every stream, while we wandered lost in their forests." The Vietnamese used clever tactics that neutralized Mongol strengths. They built barricades across jungle paths, forcing Mongol cavalry into narrow spaces where their mobility meant nothing. They used poisoned stakes hidden in the undergrowth to injure horses. They deliberately flooded lowland areas to create mud that bogged down the Mongol advance. At the Battle of Tai Ket, Mongol reinforcements walked into a deadly ambush. Vietnamese fighters had spent days digging trenches and pits along the likely approach routes. As the Mongol column marched along a narrow jungle path, the ground beneath them suddenly gave way, sending men and horses tumbling into spike-filled pits. From the surrounding jungle, thousands of arrows flew, cutting down Mongol officers. The screams of dying men and horses echoed through the forest as the Vietnamese closed in for the kill. As losses mounted and supplies dwindled, Prince Togan realized his mighty army was in danger of complete destruction. With great reluctance, he ordered a retreat to China, harassed all the way by Vietnamese forces. The retreat quickly became chaotic, with Vietnamese attackers picking off stragglers and ambushing the rear guard. What had begun as a certain conquest ended in a humiliating withdrawal, with thousands of Mongol corpses left rotting in the Vietnamese jungle. Kublai Khan was furious at this defeat. His empire stretched across most of Asia, yet this small kingdom continued to defy him. In late 1287, he ordered a third and even larger invasion, determined to crush the Vietnamese resistance once and for all. Once again led by Prince Togon, this massive force advanced by both land and sea. The Mongols had learned from their previous defeat and came better prepared for the climate and terrain. They brought more disease-resistant southern Chinese troops and supplies designed to last through a longer campaign. The early battles once again favored the Mongols. At Von Keep, a fierce clash left thousands of dead on both sides. The Vietnamese fought bravely, but the sheer numbers and determination of the Mongol force proved too much. The Vietnamese line eventually broke, and warriors scattered into the surrounding countryside. Tran Hung Jiao knew that this third invasion represented the greatest threat yet to Vietnamese independence. He gathered his commanders and outlined a daring plan that would use the Mongols' aggressive nature against them. The plan centered on the Bac Giang River, a wide waterway leading to the Vietnamese heartland. Tran Hung Jiao ordered thousands of wooden stakes to be sharpened, capped with iron points, and planted in the riverbed at a strategic point. For weeks, Vietnamese workers labored day and night, hammering the stakes deep into the mud of the riverbed. These stakes were positioned to remain hidden during high tide, but become exposed during low tide, creating a deadly trap for ships. In early 1288, as the Mongol fleet sailed up the Bac Giang River during high tide, a small Vietnamese fleet approached them, attacked briefly, and then retreated. The Mongol commander Omar Batur ordered his ships to pursue the apparently fleeing Vietnamese vessels. "Chase them down! Let none escape!" Omar Batur shouted to his captains. The Mongol ships surged forward, their oarsmen pulling hard in pursuit of what seemed like an easy victory. Unknown to the Mongols, this retreat was carefully timed with the tides. As the water level fell with the outgoing tide, the Mongol ships suddenly found themselves impaled on the hidden stakes. The sound of splintering wood filled the air as hundreds of vessels were stranded, their hulls pierced, unable to maneuver in the shallow water. "What treachery is this?" cried the Mongol commander as his flagship lurched to a stop, impaled on the hidden spikes. It was at this moment that the main Vietnamese fleet counterattacked. Fire arrows rained down on the trapped Mongol ships, setting sails and decks ablaze. Thick, black smoke billowed into the sky as vessel after vessel caught fire. Vietnamese warriors in smaller, more maneuverable boats swarmed around the immobilized enemy vessels. They used grappling hooks to climb aboard the larger ships, engaging in bloody hand-to-hand combat on the decks. The fighting was savage. Mongol soldiers fought desperately, knowing there was nowhere to retreat. The river turned red with blood as men from both sides fell into the water. But the advantage clearly lay with the Vietnamese, who could maneuver freely while the Mongol ships remained trapped. By sunset, the battle had become a slaughter. Hundreds of Mongol ships burned like funeral pyres against the darkening sky. Omar Batur made a last stand on the deck of his flagship, surrounded by his personal guard. They fought bravely, but were eventually overwhelmed by waves of Vietnamese attackers. The Mongol commander fell with multiple spear wounds, his body tumbling into the bloody waters of the Bac Giang River. Thousands of Mongol warriors perished in the battle, either cut down in combat, burned alive on their ships, or drowned trying to escape. The destruction of the fleet also cut off supplies to the Mongol land forces, forcing them to retreat once again. The land battle that followed completed the victory. As news of the naval disaster spread, the Mongol land army's morale collapsed. Vietnamese forces closed in from all sides, harassing the retreating Mongols day and night. Ambushes were set along the withdrawal routes, turning the retreat into a nightmare of constant attacks. By the time the battered Mongol army crossed back into China, it had lost nearly half its original strength. The Battle of Bac Giang River marked the end of Mongol ambitions to conquer Vietnam. The defeat was so complete that Kublai Khan, despite his rage, recognized that the cost of subduing this small but determined kingdom was simply too high. In the years that followed, the Mongols and Vietnamese established a tributary relationship. a face-saving arrangement that allowed the Mongols to claim Vietnam as a vassal, while actually leaving the country independent in all practical matters. The Vietnamese victories against the Mongols rank among history's most impressive examples of a smaller nation successfully resisting a superpower through superior strategy, determination, and use of terrain. General Tran Hung Giao became a national hero, revered to this day in Vietnam. His military wisdom and strategic brilliance influenced Vietnamese military thinking for centuries. Temples honoring him can be found throughout the country. The victory preserved Vietnamese independence and culture during a time when many ancient civilizations were being absorbed into the Mongol Empire. Like their defeat at Ain Jalut at the hands of the Mamluks, the failed invasions of Vietnam revealed that with the right strategy, courage, and circumstances, even the mightiest empire could be stopped. As a Vietnamese poem written after the final Mongol retreat proclaimed, "The dragon of the south has teeth and claws. The invader learns this truth too late. Our rivers remain ours. Our mountains stand tall. The storm is past, but we remain."